Chapter 1. The Sound of Fragile Things. It begins in silence. Not the comfortable silence of a winter night, but the uneasy hush that fills an old room draped in shadows. There are footsteps echoing against marble, soft and measured, as though afraid the world itself might shatter. You, dear listener, may think you know fragility. You may picture thin glassware on a dinner table, a wine glass trembling at the edge. But what if that trembling was your own? What if the glass was not on the table, but beneath your skin, inside your very bones? This is the story of one such man. His name is Adrien Delorme. Born in 1515 in a city that has since been swallowed by modernity, Adrien lived in a world awakening to wonders and terrors, the hiss of alchemy, the whisper of forbidden sciences, the gleam of glass newly prized as never before. Paris, then, was a city straddling centuries. Lanterns glowed against the dusk, carriages rattled through winding alleys, and in the grand halls of the wealthy, rumors trickled like wine, of minds broken by melancholy, of men convinced they were made not of flesh and blood, but something impossibly fragile. Adrien was the youngest son of a minor noble. He wore velvet coats and learned Latin from a tutor whose breath always smelled of old books. His mother would remind him gently of the family's delicate reputation, as if their social standing might splinter if handled too roughly. His father, stern and silent, prized control above all else. For Adrien, childhood was a series of cautions. Do not run, do not climb, do not speak out of turn. The world was full of hidden cracks. Yet even as a child, Adrien noticed the glass. In the drawing room, crystal decanters shimmered in the candlelight. In the cathedral, stained glass windows poured colored light across the pews. He watched craftsmen at work, their breaths fogging the cooling orbs, their hands deft and steady, spinning goblets from molten threads. The sight awed him. How something so beautiful could also be so breakable. At 13, Adrien fell ill. The fever was brief, a common plague of the season, but afterward something had shifted. His senses grew sharp, almost painfully so. He heard the brittle snap of a twig, and it was as if the world itself was breaking. He could not bear to be touched. The hands of his nursemaid seemed too heavy, her fingers blunt and clumsy. At night he lay awake, haunted by visions of shattering. Sometimes he imagined the glass in the house multiplying, filling every corner, pressing in on him until he could barely breathe. His parents worried. They sent for doctors who bled him and muttered about the excesses of youth. They called in priests who murmured prayers and sprinkled holy water on his brow. Nothing helped. Adrien became quiet and withdrawn, avoiding sunlight, walking with slow, measured steps. He would not sit on wooden chairs, too hard. He refused to ride in carriages, afraid of sudden jolts. But as the months passed, his world grew smaller. By 16, he rarely left his rooms. Servants learned to avoid sudden movements in his presence, to close doors gently. Adrien spent hours at his window, watching rain slide down the panes. Sometimes he pressed his fingers to the cold surface and tried to imagine what it would be like to be on the other side, outside of his own skin, outside of fear. It was around this time that whispers reached his family. Stories circulated among the Parisian elite. The Duke of Burgundy refused to be hugged by his children, convinced he might break. A scholar in Rouen slept on featherbeds, believing himself lighter than air. But Adrian's delusion was particular, rooted not just in fear, but in fascination with the material itself. Glass was not just fragile, it was, to Adrian, pure, transparent, honest. One winter evening, as the wind rattled the shutters, Adrian's father came to him. He sat beside his son, an unfamiliar softness in his eyes. "Adrian, you must learn to trust your own body. It is not glass. You are flesh and blood, as we all are." Adrian did not respond. He looked at his father, at the hands that had once lifted him as a boy, and wondered, did his father feel the fragility too? Or was it only him, alone in his glass cage? The city outside moved on. Revolution brewed in the taverns. Philosophers argued in the salons. Adrian's world, meanwhile, contracted to the width of his window, the boundaries of his skin. He began to keep a journal, filling page after page with observations of light, of silence, of the peculiar shiver he felt when someone passed too close. He wrote, "My soul is clear as glass and just as likely to shatter." It is easy now, centuries later, to dismiss such fears as madness, but to Adrian it was real, a certainty as solid as iron or as delicate as crystal. He was not alone, though he could not have known it. Across Europe, others were gripped by the same delusion, each imprisoned in their own transparent worlds. The months turned to years. Adrian's family grew desperate. They were their only son, the last hope for the lineage. Doctors came and went, offering new remedies. None succeeded. Adrian's isolation became legend among the nobles, a cautionary tale whispered in candle-lit drawing rooms. But in the spring of his 19th year, everything changed. The city, restless after a harsh winter, seemed on the verge of something new. And Adrian, too, would soon discover that even glass can be transformed by heat, by pressure, or by the force of the unexpected.
Chapter 2. The Visitor.
As the pale spring sun finally thawed the city, Adrien Delorme's world remained unchanged, hermetic, sealed by layers of caution and dread. His parents, aging and anxious, wandered their stately home with the quiet desperation of those who fear the future will offer only loss. Adrien's room, with its windows overlooking the Rue de Rosiers, had become both his cell and his sanctuary. Yet outside, Paris itself was stirring. The world was on the cusp of the unimaginable, the edge of scientific discovery, whispers of new philosophies, even rumors of royal madness. In salons and taverns alike, the city gossiped not just about the king's dark moods, but of stranger afflictions. Noblemen who refused to shake hands, young women who wrapped themselves in silks to protect the glass within. Adrien was not alone, though solitude was all he knew. It was during one such dawn, when the mists curled through the narrow streets and the bells of St. Paul tolled faintly, that the visitor arrived. Adrien's mother, thin and drawn from sleepless nights, came to his door with a new name, Monsieur Girard, a physician from Amsterdam. He is said to have cured melancholies far more grave than yours. Adrien felt only a familiar tightening in his chest. He did not wish to see anyone, much less another doctor with hopeful eyes and failed remedies. But his parents were resolute, and so, on a Tuesday when the sky threatened rain, Adrien received Monsieur Girard in his chamber. The physician was not what Adrien expected. He was younger, his accent thick, his eyes alert. He carried not vials and leeches, but a thin notebook and a single glass paperweight, perfectly round, clear as water, catching every ray of sunlight. Girard asked no immediate questions. He simply sat and observed. The silence stretched, and Adrien, unsettled, watched the light refract through the sphere. At last Girard spoke, his voice soft and unhurried. "Tell me, Monsieur Delorme, what does it feel like?" Adrien hesitated. He had grown so used to silence that the question stung. After a moment he answered, "It is as if my body is hollow, as if every movement threatens a fracture I cannot see. I feel the world's weight against me. I am transparent, perhaps, exposed." Girard nodded, turning the paperweight between his fingers. "And yet glass, you know, is not so weak as we believe. It is only the sudden shock, the careless blow that shatters it. Treated gently, glass endures." This idea lingered in Adrien's mind long after the physician left. For the first time in years, he wondered if his body's fragility was not a curse, but a condition, a state of being that could, perhaps, be managed. Over the following weeks, Girard visited often. He brought books, not just of medicine, but of natural philosophy and poetry. He spoke of light and optics, of glassmakers in Venice who shaped their creations with fire and breath. Adrien found himself drawn to these tales, imagining himself among them, not as a patient, but as an artisan. One evening, Girard brought news from the outside. There is to be a festival celebrating the unveiling of a new stained glass window at Notre Dame. The city will be alight. He paused, searching Adrien's face. "You should see it." Adrien recoiled. The very thought of the crowd, the jostling bodies, the risk of being touched, filled him with terror. Yet Girard persisted, gently but firmly, over several days. "Sometimes," he said, "the world must be faced to be understood. If you are glass, then let the light pass through you." Finally, with his parents' anxious blessing, Adrien agreed. He prepared for days, practicing careful steps, rehearsing how he might avoid sudden movements. On the morning of the festival, he dressed in his softest linen, every seam checked for roughness, every shoe cushioned. As they made their way through the city, Adrien's senses overwhelmed him. The sounds were thunderous, the light blinding. But Girard's steady presence calmed him, guiding him through the streets to the cathedral's great plaza. There the crowd parted, sensing perhaps his distress, or perhaps simply moved by the sight of a nobleman so pale and brittle. And then the windows themselves, newly installed, radiating every color imaginable, turning the air into something rich and surreal. Adrien gazed upward, tears in his eyes, as shafts of light fractured and danced across his skin. For a moment, he did not feel weak or strange. He felt transformed. as if part of something miraculous and new. Afterward, Gerard led him away from the crowd, settling on a bench by the Seine. The physician handed him the glass paperweight. "You see," he said, "glass can endure beauty, even as it endures fear." For Adrian, the world seemed wider now, though not less perilous. As he returned home, exhausted but alive, he knew this was only the beginning. The city's whispers, the rumors of glass souls and fragile minds, felt less like a sentence and more like a secret language, a fellowship of the unseen, waiting to be discovered. Yet even as hope flickered, danger lurked. For in Paris there were those who saw glass not as a metaphor, but as a threat, a weakness in a world built on power. And soon Adrian would learn that transparency could invite not just empathy, but envy, suspicion, and the machinery of fate. The festival marked a turning, not only for Adrian, but for the city itself. In the weeks that followed, strange occurrences unsettled the Lorme household. Mirrors shattered without warning. A servant claimed to see Adrian's reflection move independently, as if a separate spirit haunted the glass. Adrian's dreams grew more vivid. He saw himself walking barefoot across a floor of crystal, each step a gamble. He heard voices behind the walls, murmuring in forgotten tongues. Sometimes he woke convinced that the world outside was nothing but a vast, delicate case, one careless gesture away from collapse. But now, for the first time, Adrian did not face his fears alone. He had Gerard, the enigmatic physician. He had his journal, filled with hopes and terrors. And he had, buried deep within, the memory of colored light refracted through ancient glass, a promise, perhaps, that even the most fragile things can endure and sometimes even shine. The city was changing, and Adrian would change with it, whether by choice or by necessity. But for now, he let the memory of the festival linger, a prism through which even the darkest thoughts might be scattered, softened, made bearable by the strange and shining world beyond his window.
Chapter 3. Shards and Shadows.
A month had passed since Adrian's night at the cathedral, yet the city had not returned to stillness. Paris was never quiet in spring. The sense of baking bread and new rain mingled in the winding alleys, and revolution in science, art, and the restless hearts of men throbbed just beneath the surface. Adrian, too, found no peace. His outing had ignited a spark within him, one that burned with questions and a restless, disquieting hope. He spent his mornings by the window, journal in hand, eyes hungry for light and movement. He watched children skipping along the Rue des Rosières, their laughter flitting upward like birdsong, impossibly careless. In these moments, Adrian felt almost invisible, half spirit, half memory, lingering between the comfort of his solitude and the ache of possibility. But his condition, that ancient, unnameable fragility, did not loosen its grip. On the contrary, it seemed, at times, to grow stronger, evolving with each new stimulus. The mere thought of crowds could send a cold shiver through his bones, yet the memory of colored glass haunted his waking hours. Adrian's nights were troubled, his dreams even more so. he found himself wandering endless halls of crystal, his footsteps echoing on invisible floors, while a shadowy figure, faceless and patient, followed just behind. One afternoon, as rain hammered the city's slate roofs, Adrian was startled by a knock on his chamber door. Expecting Girard, he instead found his father, grave and austere, standing in the threshold. In his hands, the old man clutched a letter bearing the seal of the royal court. "You have been summoned," his father announced. "The king himself wishes to consult those suffering from the melancholies of the mind. They seek new cures, it is said, and fresh insights." Adrian's heart thudded against his ribs. He felt exposed, as if his affliction had been dragged from the quiet shadows of his home and set before the entire city. Still, the summons was not a request, but a command. Even the frail must answer when the king calls. The following week passed in a blur. Adrian's mother oversaw his preparations with trembling hands, fretting over every detail: his best coat, his gentlest shoes, the angle of his hat. Girard visited daily, offering encouragement and techniques to calm his anxiety, breathing exercises, lines of poetry, the reassurance that glass, though breakable, could endure careful hands. The day of the audience arrived, bleak and clouded, as if the sky itself sensed the coming trial. The carriage ride to the palace was a torture of jolts and rattles. Adrian clenched his jaw until his teeth ached, willing himself not to fracture under the motion. The royal physician greeted him, ushering him through marble halls that gleamed cold and merciless. Adrian's every step seemed to echo 1,000-fold, as if he walked through a cathedral of glass, each sound a threat. Inside a gilded chamber sat King Charles VI, known to many as Charles the Mad. He was older than Adrian expected, with haunted eyes and a trembling hand clutching the armrest of his throne. Adrian was not alone. Beside him, a cluster of noblemen and scholars, all bearing the unmistakable air of melancholy. The king's gaze fixed on Adrian, searching and sad. "He tell me," the monarch asked, his voice softer than rumor, "what does it mean to live with the fear of breaking?" Adrian hesitated, surrounded by faces both curious and pitying. He felt their stares like weight pressing on glass. At last he spoke. "It is not only fear, Your Majesty. It is an awareness of how easily the world is damaged, how fragile every boundary can be. We walk careful, not because we wish to, but because we must. We do not seek pity, only understanding." The king nodded, and for a moment an unspoken bond flickered between them, a recognition, a kinship of broken minds. The audience lasted hours. Scholars questioned Adrian about his symptoms, his thoughts, his dreams. One physician suggested that perhaps his soul was simply too pure for this world. Another whispered that glass was the future, a metaphor for all men who live beneath the threat of shattering. Yet not all were sympathetic. One courtier, sharp-eyed and ambitious, scoffed openly at Adrian's words. "Fragility is the province of the idle and the weak," he sneered. "What good is a man who dares not move for fear of breaking?" Adrian said nothing. He did not have the words to defend his condition, not to those who measured strength only by noise and force. But as the gathering dispersed, the king lingered, inviting Adrian to remain. In private, Charles VI confessed his own terrors. "They say I am mad," the king murmured, "but I have seen men break for lesser reasons than my own. I too have feared the touch of others. I too have dressed in iron and silk, hoping to stave off the world." Adrian listened, and for the first time felt less alone. If a king could bear such burdens, perhaps there was hope for him as well. When Adrian finally left the palace, dusk had fallen, and the world seemed softer, veiled in the forgiving light of evening. Yet as the carriage rolled through Paris, Adrian sensed a change. Word of his condition, of his glass soul, spread quickly through the city. Some called him saint, others fool, but all were watching now, curious and hungry. Adrian's sanctuary shrank again, his privacy traded for rumor and fascination. At home, Girard waited, anxious. The world is not always kind to those it cannot understand, but you must not hide. There is strength sometimes in transparency. Adrian nodded, unsure. That night, as he drifted into uneasy sleep, the dream returned. Corridors of crystal, the faceless figure always one step behind. Only now the figure spoke, its voice like splintering ice. "You are seen, and to be seen is to be vulnerable." Adrian woke with a start, heart pounding. He rose and approached the window, pressing his palm to the cool glass. Below, Paris glowed, 1,000 points of light in the darkness, each one fragile, each one beautiful. For the first time, Adrian understood he was not a prisoner, nor a spectacle, but a reflection of the world itself. Fragile, yes, but also full of the potential to catch and scatter the light. The city would press closer now, with all its dangers and its wonders. But Adrian was changing. With each passing day, he felt less like a man of glass and more like a man forged by it. Transparent, yes, but also luminous. Tomorrow would bring new trials, and the shadows behind the glass would not easily fade. But for now, Adrian allowed himself hope. A fragile thing, perhaps, but enduring, even in a world that so often seemed intent on breaking.
Chapter 4. The Breaking Point.
If you were to walk the streets of Paris that spring, you would hear Adrian's name whispered in the same breath as the city's latest miracles and misfortunes. Some said he was a prophet, a living parable in an age obsessed with surfaces and secrets. Others muttered that he was cursed, a warning to the proud and the delicate alike. And always, threading through the gossip like a fissure in glass, was the rumor that Adrian Delorme was not a man at all, but a vessel of pure crystal, one careless word away from ruin. Within the Delorme household, life grew stranger with each passing week. Letters arrived daily, some seeking cures for their own glass affliction, others offering patronage or threats. Adrian's mother, who had once navigated society's subtleties with ease, now retreated into her music and prayers. His father became irritable, his pride bruised by the attention Adrian's condition attracted, fearing the family's position would crack beneath the city's scrutiny. Girard, ever faithful, kept his visits regular, though even he could not shield Adrian from the relentless pressure of public curiosity. Each day, Adrian faced new challenges, invitations to salons, requests for interviews from foreign scholars, anonymous notes slipped under his door by those who claimed to understand him, or, more chillingly, to envy him. One morning, while Adrian studied the play of sunlight on a vase of white tulips, the door opened abruptly and a young woman stepped in. She was unlike anyone Adrian had met. Her hair short as a boy's, her eyes bright with mischief and intent. "Forgive me," she said with a bow. "I am Lucienne Charvet. I have come to see the man of glass." Adrian froze, unsure whether to bristle at the intrusion or retreat into politeness. "I am not made of glass," he replied, more softly than intended. She smiled, taking a seat across from him. "No, but you live as if you might shatter at any moment. That is almost the same thing, is it not?" Lucienne was a painter, it turned out, one of the city's few women accepted, even grudgingly, by the Academy. She spoke with rapid-fire wit, her hands forever sketching shapes in the air. She confessed that she had followed Adrian's story for weeks and wished to paint his portrait, not as a curiosity, but as a study of fragility and strength. "At first, I thought to capture only your suffering," she admitted. "But now I think it is your hope that interests me more. Even the most delicate glass can catch the light, can it not?" Reluctantly, Adrian agreed, and so began a series of sittings that unsettled and intrigued him in equal measure. Lucienne worked with almost reckless speed, her brushes bold, her questions bolder still. "What do you fear most?" she asked while dabbing at her canvas. "Is it the pain of breaking or the shame of being broken before others?" Adrian thought long on her words. He spoke of his childhood, of the warnings and the caution, the sensation that even the world's gentlest hands might do him harm. Yet he also confessed a longing to run, to dance, to laugh without restraint. Lucienne listened without judgment, her gaze intent, as if searching for cracks invisible to the naked eye. Outside, the world grew restless. The king's madness was now an open secret. The city trembled with rumors of insurrection, of conspiracies whispered in the dark. Adrian's own notoriety became both shield and sword. He was courted by radicals eager to claim him as a symbol, proof that even the privileged were not immune to the era's anxieties. One evening, after a sitting, Lucienne led Adrian to her studio near the Pont Neuf. It was a ramshackle affair, full of half-finished canvases and the scent of oil paint. There, among her works, Adrian saw himself reflected, not as an invalid, but as a figure alive with color and possibility. She had painted him surrounded by light, his body clear as crystal, but his gaze steady and unafraid. "I wanted to show you as you are, but also as you might become," Lucienne said quietly. The portrait unsettled him. For days afterward, Adrian grappled with a strange mixture of pride and terror. He wondered if Lucienne had glimpsed a truth he could not admit, that his greatest fear was not shattering, but remaining forever unchanged. It was during these tumultuous days that disaster struck. One night, a brick crashed through the Delorme window, shattering a lamp and setting the drapes ablaze. Adrian's father, ever vigilant, managed to douse the flames, but the message was clear. Not everyone viewed Adrian's glass affliction with fascination. Some saw it as an insult, an affront to the old order. Fear returned, sharp as broken crystal. For weeks, Adrian barely left his room. The household tightened around him, their every step a negotiation with anxiety. Lucienne continued to visit, refusing to be cowed by the danger. She told him stories of artists who had faced ridicule and exile for their visions, of inventors jailed for challenging accepted truths. "Courage is not the absence of fear," she said one day. "It is daring to move even when the world expects you to freeze." It was a lesson Adrian tried to hold close, even as the city's mood darkened. Rumors of war, famine, and plague returned. The king, they said, now believed himself made of glass as well, refusing to leave his chambers or receive visitors. One evening, as thunder rolled over Paris, Adrian dreamed again of the crystal corridors. But this time, when the faceless figure appeared, Adrian did not flee. He stepped forward, reaching out his hand. The figure dissolved into light, and Adrian awoke with tears on his cheeks, an unfamiliar feeling, half terror, half joy. Change was coming, both for Adrian and for Paris. The city was a crucible, and Adrian, once content to be hidden, felt the first tremors of a resolve he had not known he possessed. The breaking point was near, but for the first time, Adrian wondered if what shattered might not be his own spirit, but the walls that kept him apart from the world. As spring deepened into summer, Adrian arose each morning with a new determination. He opened his window wide, letting in the noise and chaos of the streets. He began to walk the halls of his home more boldly, to greet the servants and speak with his father about matters beyond his illness. Even Gerard noticed the change. "You are not cured, Adrian," the physician observed, "but you are no longer hiding. Sometimes that is the greatest cure of all." And in the quiet moments when the city paused between storms, Adrian could almost believe it. The world outside was still dangerous, still capable of cruelty and misunderstanding, but so too was it capable of wonder, a wonder that could, perhaps, endure even the sharpest break. The night before Bastille Day, Adrian stood at his window watching as fireworks scattered across the Parisian sky. The sound was deafening, but he did not flinch. Instead, he pressed his palm against the glass, feeling its cool, solid reassurance. He whispered for himself and for all the others who walked in fear, "I am not glass. I am light within glass, and I will not break, not tonight, not ever."
Chapter 5. Refractions.
In the city's oldest quarter, where the stone streets curved like the veins of ancient leaves, Adrian Delorme became both legend and spectacle. Paris, never short of saints or sinners, now boasted a man of glass, whose story cut through the noise of politics and war like a glint of sunlight across a blade. People came from far and wide to catch a glimpse of him, some out of curiosity, some with hope, some with something darker in their hearts. The world outside Adrian's window had grown feverish. The city's mood, already volatile, had been sharpened by the approach of midsummer. Riots flared and faded. News of the king's further decline traveled on every wind, blending with stories of revolution, miraculous healings, and curses. The crowd had always been both Adrian's greatest fear and, increasingly, his fascination. But within the walls of the Delorme estate, time ticked by in a strange cadence. Adrian's mother continued her retreat into ritual and prayer. His father obsessed over letters and ledgers, the accounts of their estate a brittle shield against social collapse. Only Gerard and Lucien dared to pierce the hush with conversation and challenge. One morning, Adrian awoke to the sound of glass breaking. He bolted upright, heart thundering, expecting to see shards scattered across the floor. But it was only the maid who had dropped a decanter in the hall. Still, the sound haunted him, as if it were an omen, one he could not ignore. His days began to take new urgency. He walked longer, sometimes venturing beyond the garden, the sunlight on his face both balm and threat. The city's rumors followed him, whispers curling around every corner. They say he cannot be touched. He has survived what would have destroyed lesser men. I heard he shattered once and was remade by a foreign doctor. See how the light bends around him. Adrian felt these rumors as both burden and armor. At times he resented them. At others he found in them the echo of a truth he could not quite name. He continued to meet with Lucien, whose portrait of him now hung, unfinished, above the mantel in her studio. Each visit left him changed, more willing to examine his fear, more able to challenge it. One afternoon, as thunderclouds gathered, Lucien pressed Adrian to sit for her once more. She worked in silence, her hands deft, the air in the studio thick with anticipation. Finally, she spoke, her tone gentle but insistent. "You have seen your world from within glass your whole life, Adrian. What do you see now when you look back at it?" Adrian paused. The question unsettled him. He had grown so used to observing, to measuring every risk, that the act of looking outward had become foreign. "At first," he said, voice low, "I saw only danger. Every movement threatened disaster. But now I think I see possibility. I am still afraid, but I am also curious. The world is larger than my fears." Lucien smiled. "Then let that be your portrait. Not a prisoner of glass, but someone who walks through it, changed by it, but not defined." Their conversation was interrupted by Gerard, who arrived with troubling news. There had been another attack, not at the Delorme home, but at the apothecary who had once treated Adrian. The window smashed, the word fraud painted on the door. The city, it seemed, was growing less tolerant of those who deviated from its expectations, no matter how innocent. Adrian listened in silence. For the first time, he felt something hot and unfamiliar rise within him, anger, not just at his own fate, but at the smallness of those who would punish difference with violence. That evening, as a storm rolled over Paris, Adrian called a meeting in the salon, a room that had been silent for too long. He asked his father, his mother, Lucien, and Gerard to join him. It was time, he said, to speak not as patient or invalid, but as someone ready to claim a place in the world beyond his fears. They gathered in the flickering candlelight, the thunder outside making the walls shudder. Adrian spoke plainly, for the first time in his life, of what he wanted: to see the city as it was, to meet those who suffered as he had, to use his visibility not as a shield, but as a bridge. He did not want to hide behind drawn curtains or the pity of strangers. His father objected, voicing concern for their reputation, their safety, even Adrian's health. But Adrian did not retreat. With Lucien's quiet encouragement and Gerard's steady support, he persuaded his family that retreat would only make their lives smaller, their fears sharper. By the time the storm passed, an uneasy agreement had been reached. Adrian would appear in public not as an exhibit, but as a voice, an advocate for understanding, for compassion towards those afflicted by fears the world dismissed as weakness. The weeks that followed were a study in tension and courage. Adrian attended salons and gatherings, sometimes to polite applause, sometimes to sneers. He met others who suffered, men who believed themselves hollow, women who would not be touched, children who cried at sudden noises. Adrian listened, offered what solace he could, and in return found a sense of kinship that eased his isolation. Yet with each public appearance the risks grew. Not all were willing to accept Adrian's message. Some called him a fraud, others a madman. Anonymous threats arrived, some crude, some chillingly clever. Adrian learned to move with caution, not because he believed he would shatter, but because the world, for all its beauty, could still be vicious. Through it all, Lucien and Gerard remained by his side. The physician chronicled Adrian's progress for a treatise on the mind's ailments. Lucien finished her portrait, unveiling it at a gathering of artists and patrons. The painting showed Adrian standing before a window, light refracted around him, his posture both tentative and unbowed. The unveiling was met with stunned silence, then applause. Although whether for the art or the courage it represented, Adrian could not say. That night, walking home through rain-soaked streets, Adrian felt the weight of his journey. He was no longer the boy who cowered in his chamber, counting the cracks in the ceiling. He had learned, painfully and imperfectly, to move through fear, not because it had left him, but because he refused to let it rule him. The world had not changed. Paris was still dangerous, still indifferent to the suffering of the fragile. But in the play of street lamps on the wet cobbles, Adrian saw another kind of truth, that strength, like glass, is found not in unyielding hardness, but in the willingness to let light and pain pass through. In the coming months, more trials would arrive. The city would not easily let go of its need for spectacle, nor would Adrian be spared from its darker tides. But as he turned the key in his door that night, he knew he was not only surviving, he was becoming something new, something luminous. His reflection, caught in the hall mirror, smiled back, 1,000 shards of self held together by hope and a future yet unwritten.
Chapter 6. Transparent Revolutions.
A summer scorched the rooftops of Paris. The city's pulse grew ragged with anticipation. The sound of hammers and voices filled the streets. Preparations for festivals, barricades for rumored riots, all the feverish energy of a place on the brink. The people, restless and hungry for meaning, sought omens in every broken window and every starless night. Adrien Delorme, who had lived most of his life hidden in the penumbra of his own fears, now found himself swept into the city's bright glare. He had become a reluctant celebrity, admired by some, mocked by others, studied by a handful of earnest physicians, and lampooned by pamphleteers who found in him a perfect metaphor for a fragile nobility. Yet Adrien was no longer content to let the world define him. With Gerard's careful guidance and Lucien's relentless honesty, he made his way through the city, attending salons and hospitals, accepting invitations to speak to gatherings large and small. At times, his courage felt brittle. At others, it shimmered, unsteady but undeniable. One humid afternoon, Adrien visited the Hôtel Dieu, the city's ancient hospital, where the air was thick with the scent of vinegar and fear. Here, Gerard introduced him to men and women whose delusions took forms both familiar and strange. A merchant who believed his breath was poison, a laundress certain her bones had turned to ice, a boy who wore a helmet at all times for fear his head might float away. Adrien listened to their stories, sharing his own in return. For many, this was the first time they'd heard their feels echoed by someone else. He spoke not as a prophet or a martyr, but as a companion, one who had also walked the trembling edge between dread and hope. When he returned home that evening, Adrien found Lucienne waiting with a new letter, this one from an unlikely source. Princess Alexandra of Bavaria, herself rumored to suffer from a peculiar glass delusion, had heard of Adrien and wished to correspond. Her words were carefully penned, formal yet intimate, full of questions. How did he bear the gaze of the crowd? Did he ever feel as if the world might shatter under his steps? Was there hope of living freely with such knowledge? Adrien replied at once, grateful for the lifeline. He wrote with candor, describing his terrors, but also the moments of illumination when the light caught just right and everything, even pain, was beautiful. Their exchange became a secret refuge, a place where vulnerability felt not only safe, but powerful. Meanwhile, the city's turbulence seeped further into Adrien's life. One evening, while returning from a talk at the Academy of Sciences, he found himself caught in a swelling crowd near the Place de Grève. Shouts rose, stones flew. Someone recognized Adrien and called out, first in curiosity, then in scorn. A young man, wild-eyed and desperate, pressed forward. Do you not fear we will all break, that there is nothing left but splinters?" Adrien met the man's gaze. "We all fear something," he said, voice trembling. "But fear does not have to be our end." The crowd's mood shifted, confused, almost chastened. Adrien hurried Adrien away, but the words echoed long after. He realized that in being seen, in naming what had once been hidden, he had gained a kind of power, a fragile one, yet real. Back at the estate, trouble brewed beneath the surface. His father's health, once robust, now failed. The older man raged at his own weakness, cursing the changing times, the insatiable curiosity of Paris, and sometimes, in bitter whispers, his own son's glass-born shame. Yet in rare, lucid moments, Adrien's father spoke with an aching tenderness, recalling Adrien's childhood, the laughter and tears that marked their shared history. "Perhaps," he said one dusk, his voice thin as a reed, "we are all made of glass in the end, only some have the courage to admit it." Lucienne's work, too, was changing. Her new series of paintings, inspired by Adrien and those like him, caught the city's eye. Critics debated their meaning. Were they celebrations of vulnerability or accusations against a society that punished it? Lucienne cared little for their opinions.
For her, the paintings were a way to honor what survived, beauty within the cracks, light through every fracture. One stormy night, Adrian found himself wandering the halls of his childhood home. He paused before a tall mirror in the corridor, candle in hand. His reflection stared back, pale, eyes shadowed but alert. For the first time, he looked not for flaws or threats, but for the truth of his own presence. He saw a man changed, not cured, never cured, but altered by trial and revelation. He saw, too, the faces of those he had met, Girard's steady confidence, Lucien's fearless art, Alexandra's searching questions, the crowd's hunger for hope. He realized with a jolt that their fates were all intertwined, each reflection part of a greater whole. That realization became resolve. Adrian proposed a gathering, not for nobles or scholars, but for those the world called broken. With Girard and Lucien's help, he invited patients from the hospital, artists, philosophers, and anyone willing to speak honestly about their hidden wounds. The night of the gathering, the Delorme salon buzzed with unfamiliar voices. Stories flowed of madness and melancholy, of resilience and recovery, of grief and unexpected joy. Adrian listened, sometimes speaking, sometimes silent, always attentive. What emerged was not a catalogue of melodies, but a chorus of possibility. In the flickering candlelight, Adrian felt something shift, a sense that just as glass is strongest where it has been most carefully annealed, so too might human hearts gain strength from having survived the heat of suffering. The future, he understood, would not be gentle. The city would continue to fracture and heal, to resist and embrace change. But in that room, on that night, Adrian glimpsed a new kind of resilience, one that did not deny fragility, but honored it. After the guests had gone, Adrian stood by the window, gazing out at the city. Paris, restless and shining, lay below, a mosaic of light and darkness. He pressed his hand to the glass and whispered a silent promise, to face what was to come not as an exile from his own life, but as a participant in its transformation. For the first time, the future felt not only bearable, but bright with the possibility of beauty, however fragile, however brief. And so Adrian waited, heart unguarded, for whatever dawn might bring.
Chapter 7. Glass and Revolution. The year was 1448, a year that, in the minds of future generations, would burn with the memory of rebellion and transformation. In the streets of Paris, the Fronde had begun, a revolt of princes, parliaments, and people, driven by anger at the monarchy's crushing taxes and the cardinal's overreach. For Adrian Delorme, this new turbulence was both echo and omen. The city's unrest mirrored the fracture lines that had long run unseen through his own life. Within the Delorme estate, the reverberations of the Fronde were inescapable. Soldiers marched by day and night, their boots pounding the cobbles, their muskets slung carelessly over shoulders. The price of bread soared, and the chatter of the marketplace turned sharp and desperate. Even the aristocracy felt the city's rage. Many fled to the countryside, their great houses shuttered and silent. But the Delorme family, tied by duty and by pride to their ancestral home, remained. Adrian, though anxious, found himself unable to look away from history unfolding outside his window. Lucienne arrived one evening with news. The Parlement had refused to obey the king's latest decrees. Riots had broken out in the Place Royale. "It is as if the city itself has become a shattered pane," she said, her hands stained with paint and ink. Gerard, too, was caught up in the tides of change. At the Hôtel Dieu, he saw wounded men from both sides, noble and commoner, guard and rebel, lying side by side. Some believed themselves invulnerable, others terrified of the faintest bruise, convinced that the violence of the city might splinter their very souls. The hospital corridors echoed with talk of Charles VI, the mad king of the previous century, who had once wrapped himself in iron to avoid breaking. Adrian found strange comfort in these old tales. He was not alone, nor even the first. Historical accounts brought by Gerard and Lucienne filled Adrian's days. He read about King Charles VI, the well-beloved turned the mad, who had refused to let others touch him, believing himself made of glass. He also heard rumors of Princess Alexandra of Bavaria, still living in distant Munich, who claimed to have swallowed a glass piano and now walked carefully, fearing to shatter within. The stories of other sufferers emerged from the shadows. Robert Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy, published in England a generation before, described those who lived in terror of invisible wounds and imagined frailty, that they are all glass, and therefore will not suffer no man to come near them. The delusion, Adrian realized, was not an affliction of isolation, but one that spoke to the anxieties of an age, a time when bodies and nations seemed ever on the verge of breaking. Meanwhile, the city's own glassmakers prospered and suffered in equal measure. Venetian techniques, once closely guarded, had begun to spread to Parisian workshops. Glass was no longer just a symbol of luxury, but of scientific progress and alchemical hope. The philosopher René Descartes, then writing his Meditations, used the glass delusion as proof of the mind's power to shape reality and of the dangers lurking in unchecked imagination. Adrian attended gatherings where these questions were debated, sometimes in candlelit salons, sometimes in hurried whispers on the street. Was fragility a curse or a calling? Did those who feared breaking possess some special insight into the world's true nature? Some, emboldened by the chaos of the Fronde, argued that society itself was glass, transparent, brittle, easily shattered by the blows of injustice. Others insisted that strength was found only in hardness, in the ability to endure without cracking. One night, Lucienne brought Adrian to the home of Constantin Huygens, the Dutch poet and diplomat, who was visiting Paris on matters of state. Huygens, himself rumored to have written of the glass delusion, welcomed Adrian with curiosity. The conversation, held over wine and the soft glow of leaded windows, touched on philosophy, science, and suffering. "In our time," Huygens remarked, "the world is full of costly follies. To fear breaking is, in its way, a kind of wisdom. The greatest danger is to believe oneself invulnerable. That is the madness of tyrants and of empires." Adrian listened, moved. Here, among thinkers and artists, his own fears became the stuff of inquiry rather than ridicule.
For a brief moment, he saw his life not as a string of accidents and humiliations, but as a chapter in a larger human story, one marked by both pain and beauty. But the city did not rest. News arrived of violence at the Bastille, of executions and betrayals, of families ruined overnight. Adrian's father, weakened by illness, grew haunted and withdrawn, fearing that the family's fortunes, so carefully preserved, would vanish like shards swept from a marble floor. Adrian's mother prayed for peace, her rosary beads worn thin by worry. Despite the dangers, Adrian insisted on continuing his public work. He visited the Hôtel Dieu, comforting those who suffered not just wounds of the body, but the terrors of the mind. Some believed themselves hollow, others as heavy as lead, still others convinced their heads would fall from their shoulders if they slept. Adrian's presence, steady and compassionate, offered a rare kind of solace. In these visits, Adrian met a woman who believed she was a potsherd, a fragment of ancient clay, and a young boy who refused to eat, fearing that even bread might splinter him from within. Each story, tragic and strange, mirrored the anxieties recorded by John Locke and Descartes in their own writings. Adrian's journal became a catalogue of suffering and survival, evidence perhaps that what was once considered madness might, in the light of history, be understood as a form of wisdom. One evening, as cannon fire echoed from the far end of the city, Adrian stood before the great window in his chamber. He thought of the stories that had brought him here, of kings and princesses, of glassmakers and philosophers, of rebels and healers. The city was changing, and so was he. The future was as uncertain as ever, but Adrian had found his place in it, not as an exile, but as a witness, a survivor, and perhaps a guide. The next morning, with Lucienne and Girard by his side, Adrian ventured into the heart of the city, joining a procession of those who demanded not just bread and justice, but understanding. In the square, voices rose together, echoing off the stone walls, a chorus of hope, fragile as glass, yet unbroken. In the crowd, Adrian caught sight of others, faces drawn and luminous, who recognized in him their own fears and dreams. They nodded in silent acknowledgement, a fellowship of the fragile, marching not away from the world, but deeper into its tumult and possibility. For Adrian, the era of hiding had ended. Whatever the outcome of the revolution, he knew he had become part of history, not only as a symbol of suffering, but proof that even in the most brittle times, there is beauty in the courage to endure. The future, he sensed, would not be built of iron or stone alone, but of glass, transparent, resilient, ever open to the play of light.
Chapter 8: The Age of Mirrors. As the embers of the Fronde flickered and faded, Paris drew breath, a city battered yet unbowed. The war of princes and parliaments gave way to uneasy peace, and in that lull new forces rose. The great glassworks of Saint-Gobain opened their furnaces, their fires glowing against the horizon. For the first time, French craftsmen rivaled Venetian glassmakers, and mirrored glass, once a privilege of kings, began to appear in the homes of the new bourgeoisie. Adrien Delorme felt these changes acutely. His reputation, once that of a delicate curiosity, had shifted. Now he was a figure at the edge of transformation, caught between old worlds and new. His days were marked by invitations to salons where Descartes' disciples debated the nature of reality, to lectures at the Jardin des Plantes where natural philosophers dissected not just animals, but the boundaries of reason and madness. Girard had grown busier than ever, his treatises on melancholia and delusion circulating among physicians from Leiden to London. "We are entering an age of glass and reason," he told Adrian one morning, "where even the mind's frailties are studied as one would study a rare stone, precious for what they reveal." Lucien's art had drawn acclaim as well as criticism. Her Portraits of the Fragile, featuring Adrian and other Parisians afflicted by strange beliefs, hung side by side with paintings of scientific marvels and battle scenes. Critics quarreled over her meaning. Some saw condemnation of the era's obsession with surfaces. Others glimpsed a celebration of human resilience, each crack gilded by the light of survival. Adrian, meanwhile, found himself drawn into a different world, the court of Louis XIV, now a young king. Versailles, still under construction, glittered with ambition. Adrian's notoriety reached the ears of Jean-Baptiste Colbert, the king's powerful minister and champion of French industry. Colbert sought to promote Saint-Gobain glass as a symbol of France's greatness, and Adrian, known across Europe as the Man of Glass, was invited to witness the manufacture of the king's first great hall of mirrors. It was an invitation he could not refuse. In early autumn, Adrian traveled to Saint-Gobain with Girard and Lucien. There, among roaring furnaces and sweating artisans, he watched as molten sand became liquid, then solid, transformed by human hands into sheets so perfectly smooth they reflected the world in dazzling clarity. The master glassmaker, a stooped man named Dupin, guided Adrian through the process. Glass is born from violence, from fire and breath and patience. It can be shaped, broken, and remade. There is beauty in that, don't you think? Adrian nodded, entranced by the paradox of how something so vulnerable could be in the end so enduring. At the Hall of Mirrors, workers labored day and night. Each new pane was measured, polished, and set with trembling care. As Adrian watched his own reflection multiply endlessly along the gilded walls, he felt at once immense and infinitesimal, his fears no longer hidden, but refracted for all to see. The king's court was a hive of ambition. Adrian encountered men like Blaise Pascal, whose work with probability and the nature of belief fascinated him. He overheard philosophers argue about the soul. Was it transparent like glass or clouded by desire? The Jesuit priest Mérine Mersenne spoke of music and the mathematics of harmony, insisting that even in madness there might be a pattern waiting to be discovered. Amid these dazzling minds, Adrian did not feel small. He found in the intellectual ferment a new courage to speak openly of his struggles. In one memorable exchange, he described the glass delusion as not merely a disease of nobles, but a mirror held up to an age uncertain of its own strength. To his surprise, the philosophers listened. Some saw in his words a metaphor for the city itself, Paris scarred by civil war, yet forging a new identity from its wounds. Yet Adrian's notoriety also drew envy and suspicion. There was whispers that he was a charlatan, a creature of the salons who profited from his difference. A satirical pamphlet depicted him as a man encased in a bottle, paraded through the city for the amusement of the crowd.
These attacks stung, but Adrian faced them with quiet resolve. He remembered the stories of King Charles VI, Princess Alexandra, and others who lived and died misunderstood. He chose instead to seek out those still living in the shadow of shame, visiting asylums, corresponding with doctors in Amsterdam and Vienna, collecting stories of delusion and despair. One letter came from a German alchemist, Johann Becker, who claimed he could transmute flesh into glass. Adrian read the letter aloud to Lucienne, and they laughed, partly at the absurdity, partly at the reminder that every age invents new wonders and terrors to haunt the mind. As autumn deepened, Paris filled with news of discovery. In 1665, the first scientific journal in France, the Journal des Savants, was published, reporting the latest marvels and mysteries of the world. Adrian read of Galileo's telescopes, of Leeuwenhoek's discovery of microscopic life, and saw in these breakthroughs the same hunger for clarity that had shaped his own journey. Was it any wonder that people, faced with the vastness of the unknown, sometimes clung to fictions, to the belief they might break with a touch or be seen clear through by unkind eyes? One evening, Girard invited Adrian and Lucienne to the Royal Academy of Sciences. There, under flickering chandeliers, Adrian met Christian Huygens, the brilliant Dutch mathematician and inventor, who was working on perfecting the pendulum clock and exploring the wave nature of light. Huygens shared that his own father, Constantin, had suffered the glass delusion in his youth. It is the curse of our time to imagine that the very things which make us strong, our reason, our clarity, our striving for perfection, might also render us fragile. But the universe, I believe, is stronger for its cracks. These words comforted Adrian. In the flickering mirrors of Versailles and the shadowed salons of Paris, he began to see himself not as an object to be pitied or feared, but as a participant in an era of transformation. In the winter of that year, a great frost swept through France. Ice crept along the window panes. The poor shivered in drafty tenements, while nobles retreated behind velvet drapes. Adrian spent these cold months writing, a memoir, part history, part confession. He dedicated it to those who lived not behind glass, but through it, fearful, yes, but unafraid to let the light in. By spring, copies had found their way to doctors, philosophers, and even to the court itself. Some praised its candor, others dismissed it as the ravings of a melancholic. But for many, it became a quiet guide, a record of suffering and endurance in a world always on the brink of shattering. As Paris thawed and the river broke its icy bonds, Adrian emerged from his home to walk the city. He saw it now for what it was, a vast, imperfect mirror, reflecting the hopes and terrors of an age. And as he moved through its crowded streets, he no longer feared the breaking point, for he had learned what glassmakers and kings and philosophers and poets had all discovered in their own time, that beauty, even when broken, can endure, and that to be seen, truly seen, is the first act of healing. The age of mirrors had dawned. And in its endless reflections, Adrian glimpsed not only his own future, but the bright, fragile promise of a world remade.
Chapter 9. Shattering the Reflection. Winter returned to Paris, not with violence, but with a silence deeper than snow. Adrien Delorme moved through the world like a ghost in his own life, haunted not by fear of breaking, but by the strange sense that something within him, and perhaps within the city itself, was about to change forever. The glass delusion, once a personal affliction, had become a phenomenon, a whisper on the lips of philosophers and street vendors alike. Stories multiplied. A girl in Lyon who believed she was invisible as water. A merchant in Amsterdam who wore gloves at all times, fearing the mere brush of skin would fracture his soul. Physicians and priests argued over causes. Was it the melancholic humor, as Burton claimed, or the residue of a world too swiftly transformed by science and war? None could agree. The mystery only grew. For Adrian, the old metaphors no longer sufficed. He began to wonder, was the glass delusion a disease at all, or a kind of hidden knowledge, a sensitivity to forces that most minds dismissed? In dreams he wandered vast, echoing halls of glass, watched by countless versions of himself, each fragile, each more clear than the last. One bitter night, as frost crept along his chamber's window, Adrian was visited by Girard and Lucienne. They brought with them a gift, an ancient Venetian mirror, rumored to reveal not the present, but the true self within. The object, encased in a battered frame, had survived wars and revolutions. Its surface was mottled, flawed, a patchwork of silver and shadow. They set the mirror in the center of the room and invited Adrian to look. "For years," Girard said, "you have seen yourself through the eyes of others, through rumor, fear, and hope. Tonight, see what remains when all else falls away." Adrian hesitated, then approached the glass. At first, he saw only the familiar, a man marked by worry, his hair streaked with early gray, his gaze uncertain. But as he stared, the reflections multiplied, deepening and shifting. He saw himself as a child, timid but curious, as a young man, isolated but reaching, as the public figure, brittle and luminous in candlelight. Then, for a moment that seemed to stretch beyond time, Adrian glimpsed something else. A network of figures, hundreds, thousands stretching out through the years. Kings in armor and patients in hospital gowns, children hiding beneath beds, philosophers bent over manuscripts. All shared the same haunted look, the knowledge that the world, and perhaps the self, was more breakable than it appeared. In that instant, something inside Adrian fractured, not in despair, but in revelation. He realized the glass delusion was not a flaw to be purged, nor simply a symptom of an anxious age. It was a language, ancient and half-forgotten, that spoke of vulnerability and vision. It was an inheritance passed down in secret from those who sensed that the world's surfaces hid deeper mysteries. Lucienne watched as tears rolled down Adrian's face, catching the candlelight. "What do you see?" she whispered. He replied, voice trembling, "I see that we are all glass in some way, but it is not our fragility that defines us. It is our transparency, the courage to be seen and to see." As if in answer, the mirror's surface shimmered. The room filled with a faint, high ringing, a sound like distant bells or the striking of crystal goblets. Adrian reached out and touched the mirror. Instead of cool glass, he felt a sudden warmth, as if the boundary between flesh and reflection had melted. Time seemed to slip, the past and present collapsing. He saw Charles VI, wrapped in iron, daring to laugh. Princess Alexandra, carrying her glass piano with quiet dignity.
the unnamed men and women whose stories had been lost to history, each carrying a private, shining terror. All of them, for an instant, looked back at Adrian and smiled. The mirror cracked. A single delicate fissure spread across its surface, followed by another, then another, until the whole pane was laced with silvered veins. Yet, instead of shattering, the mirror held. The cracks caught the light, scattering it across the room in thousands of tiny rainbows. Adrian laughed, a sound pure and bright. "It's beautiful," he said. "The breaking makes it beautiful." Girard and Lucien joined him, their laughter mingling with the crystalline sound. In that moment, Adrian knew that he had crossed a threshold. He was no longer afraid of breaking. The delusion, transformed, was no longer a prison, but a window, onto himself, onto others, onto the future. News of Adrian's strange miracle spread through Paris, evolving into legend. Some claimed he had been cured. Others whispered that he was a saint, touched by grace. But Adrian, ever the witness, corrected those who asked. There was no cure, only acceptance, only light through the cracks. The city moved on. The Hall of Mirrors was completed, reflecting the ambitions and anxieties of a new France. Scientific marvels multiplied, and with them new delusions, new metaphors for the fears and hopes of humankind. Yet in quiet corners, in workshops, in hospitals, in lonely bedrooms, the glass delusion endured, not as a curse, but as a reminder that every age must reckon with its own fragility and find strength not in denial, but in the courage to be transparent. Adrian lived to old age, his life chronicled by Girard, immortalized in Lucien's paintings, and remembered by those who too had walked through the world afraid to break. When he at last died, they said the light in his room seemed different, richer, scattered, full of hidden color. Some swore they heard the faint chime of glass singing in the morning air. Long after, Adrian's story was told and retold, its meaning shifting with each generation. For some, he was a relic of a superstitious past. For others, a prophet of vulnerability. But for those who truly listened, he was something more. A beacon shining through the centuries, inviting each of us to see ourselves not as perfect, but as perfectly breakable, and thus perfectly human.